Hi, Wade. I really appreciate you taking the time to send in a video, and I just wanted to kind of respond in kind. And if it's all right with you, I'm going to play a little bit of your video and then stop it occasionally to um, give you some oral feedback. I'm also, you'll see over here on this side of the screen, there is the rubric that I'll upload to ELC, and so you can get that. But most of what I'm going to say is going to come from that anyway. So anyway, let me kind of jump in here, get this rubric up so you can see it. And I'm going to start you playing here a little bit. I probably won't play the whole thing because it gets to be too long of a video, but, and you have a copy of it anyway. So anyway, I'm just going to let you get going.
I had chosen to use the video option. We'll see how this goes.
And thanks for
I
that.
used this. Was introduced to this past year, and I'm going to use this quite a bit with our COVID teaching. So we'll give it a try here. But I want to jump in here with the questions. Number one, give an honest reflection on the meaning that this topic has for you. What I chose to discuss was really just jumping right into the first element of what the authors talk about in regards to multicultural education. It must be, and I'm going to be reading from the book here as well, but multicultural education is anti-racist education. And the takeaway that I had here really, I think two dynamics. The first one is that we must be, I think he used the word, must be exactly, he did use the word, the authors did, must be consciously anti-racist. So, I thought that was really interesting. In my responses online, I talked about that's something that I actually did for a semester. I taught a unit on cross-cultural relationships, and had a book we're working from, and really was fascinated to me. So I have to kind of step back though. For me, when you talk about kind of into the second one, like how did I come to my conclusions? Did I rely on prior knowledge? For me, I've kind of been since almost the early years of my life, really a bridge builder in regards to relationships. So I've been most of my life in a multicultural context. Originally a group of Michigan, and then I moved to Miami, Florida. Sorry. So just being in that environment, I loved it. But then I found myself in particular really working a lot in African American communities. I did a lot of work in college in those areas. So my wife is actually African American. We have a multicultural family. So these kind of things are things that I've certainly, considered. They've been a part of my prior knowledge for sure. When I look at one of your questions says, did you scan your thoughts for bias? Where do they come from? I mean, certainly when you live a life of considering these things, you uncover bias. I think of probably the first time, not the first time, I guess I should say, I've always, since I was young, basketball has been a big part of my life. And, I was in a culture of basketball that was dominated by Black athletes. And from a young age, that's who I was around. And so I valued really Black culture. All
right, let me kind of stop you for a minute, and let me jump in on a few things. I think your reflections are really deep, and I really appreciate that you're digging into your thoughts with regards to your life, your multicultural family, your relationships at school, and your profession. And I just want to say what a brave perspective that is, and I really admire your willingness. As you talk about a little further in your video, you talk about willingness to kind of take it on, and but I think you have a kind of a personal inclination to share, and that's important, and it's meaningful to me. I also I think that inclination is going to serve you well as you continue to work with, particularly those Caucasian children that you report as being pretty unwilling to learn about conditions beyond what is their own. So I just think that's really special, and I really appreciate your work in that area. Let's get a little further down the road with you, and then I have some feedback with regards to.
Impacted me in a lot of ways. So, in growing up, I wanted to be around Black culture, but there were some huge adjustments in those early years. Really uncomfortable of just immersing myself in the culture and trying to learn. So when you do that, you're going to have a lot of bias that is revealed. I think certainly I haven't identified any bias, I would say, from our readings this past 2 units. But it's really kind of confirmed a few things about how this impacts my profession. What really stood out for me in particular in this unit, kind of jumped off the page at me, was the idea that if you teach in an all-white school and you're white, then multicultural education has no value. And certainly I agree with the author that that's wrong. I would like to step back and say, I was in an environment, now it was a private school, predominantly white. We had, a few really Black kids. There were a few Asian, but they were generally, and I actually taught some international classes, but those were primarily just international students. So, there was a little bit of diversity, but not much. My daughter is actually Black, my first daughter, and I have 5 kids behind her. But she's not my biological daughter, but she's my daughter, all intents and purposes. So, I've got interesting reflections from that. But what I found by and large was the white community that we were in, they were unwilling to even consider racism. Certainly they use the excuse that it's a liberal construct of, a liberal movement that wants to destroy the foundations of our country. And I really don't want to get into that discussion, but certainly there was huge pushback. And
all right, well, I think that's really worth spending a little time talking about here. I think your perspective gives you some really important insights into multicultural problems we are now facing, and even kind of facing the obstacle that you talked about, having a group of people who want to blame left liberals for changing the world and destroying the world. That probably isn't a conversation for another time, but it's not totally unrelated to what we're talking about here. But from this brief, it appears that you're a reflective guy by nature, and I want to kind of talk about that decision making aspect here as kind of the second criteria. I can easily imagine that some of your colleagues and students in your current setup are kind of inclined to misunderstand you in some ways. But that level of misunderstanding, and I hope you don't find that as a barrier, because that's a strength. It's a very powerful thing that you have, a very powerful tool that you have that makes you potentially very effective as a multicultural teacher. But I wanted to kind of push you a little bit on some of your assumptions. I think one of the things in that decision-making question is about, yes, of course, we all have prior knowledge. We all have experiences that we bring, and your experiences are quite rich. But all of our prior knowledge and experiences are really not sufficient to understand the problems. As a scholar, I want to push you a little bit deeper into some aspects of reflective reasoning. I want you to think in terms of some research or some professional literature that you could use to help you think through some of this decision you're making so that you have a framework, kind of a theoretical framework or a philosophic framework for thinking about these problems. And for example, I wanted to suggest to you that you might want to spend a few minutes looking at Reconstructionist philosophy. And there are several people that come immediately to mind. Paulo Freire, who was a Brazilian, he was an activist, and he's passed away now, but so has John Dewey, who was one of the fathers of progressive education. And progressive education is really another aspect of multiculturalism. And so I wondered if you might want to spend a few minutes kind of looking into those kind of things. And I'm just going to go ahead and wrap up with the last bit of feedback here for you, Wade. About that struggle with white administration and students who seem to be threatened by multicultural assumptions. I want you to begin to think as we begin to talk in further discussions. What are the specific things that you can do to take on the challenge to those people who are unwilling? I just want to leave you with two principles, and you've already thought of these or you've heard of these before. They're kind of old hat, but one is to remember that it's easier to ask for forgiveness. Go ahead and try things, and don't ask for permission all the time, because it's just an automatic way for people to say no. So if you do things and they work, great. And the other thing is a Latin phrase, illegitimi non carborundum, and you might want to look that up. It's on the feedback I'm giving you, but literally it means don't let the bastards grind you down. So keep doing what you're doing, and I look forward to having further conversations with you. Thank you.